Do you ever feel like the walls in this house keep secrets we're not supposed to know? It was an odd thing for Victor to say, but then again, odd moments had a way of finding us lately. I glanced up from my book, startled to find him leaning against the doorframe of my room. His tone was casual, but his eyes carried a weight that felt heavier than the words themselves. Victor wasn't just anyone. He was my mother's husband, my stepfather of 5 years. A man of quiet strength and measured words. He had a presence that commanded respect without trying. I never really understood him, not completely, but something about him made it hard not to watch, to notice. The dynamic in our house had shifted recently. My mom, ever the perfectionist, had taken on more hours at work, pouring herself into deadlines and meetings. It left me and Victor alone in the evenings more often than I was comfortable with. We didn't talk much, but when we did, his attention felt sharper than it should have. Not really, I replied, setting the book down. But I guess everyone has their secrets. Victor stepped further into the room, his hand brushing the edge of my desk. Maybe, or maybe some secrets just find us. The tension in his voice lingered as he left, leaving me with the unsettling feeling that his words were more than just idle musings. The house had always felt too large, a sprawling testament to my mother's ambition. It was a blend of old-world charm and modern convenience, a home she dreamed of since she was a girl. But despite its beauty, it felt empty most days, like a museum where people weren't meant to stay too long. Victor had moved in when I was 17, and now, at 23, I should have felt more comfortable around him. But I didn't. Not really. He wasn't cruel or cold. In fact, he was the opposite. Too attentive, too knowing. I didn't know if it was his way of being kind or if it meant something else entirely. It started innocently enough, as things like this often do. Late-night conversations in the kitchen while the world slept. The way he remembered small details about my day when no one else seemed to notice. The lingering glances I pretended not to catch. I told myself I was imagining things, that he was just being the supportive figure my mother needed him to be. But the way my skin prickled whenever he entered a room said otherwise. That night, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, my mind replaying our brief exchange. There was something about his voice that felt like a puzzle I wasn't ready to solve. I'd always prided myself on being logical, grounded. I wasn't the kind of person to overanalyze a look or a comment. But with Victor, nothing felt simple. He'd once been a stranger, a man who appeared in my mother's life after years of failed relationships and shattered trust. At first, I resented him, hated the way he seemed to slide so effortlessly into a role I hadn't asked him to play. But over time, he wore down my defenses. His patience, his charm, the quiet strength that made people want to lean on him. It was hard to hate someone like that. But it wasn't just respect I felt anymore, was it? The air in the house was different the next morning, heavy with a tension I couldn't name. My mom left early, her usual kiss on Victor's cheek hurried and distracted. I watched from the kitchen table as he stood by the window, his silhouette framed by the soft morning light. "Big day?" I asked, trying to fill the silence. He turned, his eyes meeting mine with a strange intensity. "Not really. Just thinking. About." He smiled faintly, his lips curving in a way that felt too intimate. "About how quickly things change when you're not paying attention." The words hung in the air like a challenge, daring me to look deeper, to acknowledge what I already knew but couldn't admit. Later that evening, I sat alone in my room, trying to focus on anything but the feeling gnawing at my chest. I heard his footsteps in the hallway, slow and deliberate, pausing just outside my door. "Good night," he said softly, his voice barely a whisper. And then he was gone, but the echo of his presence lingered, filling the room with an unspoken promise that things were only just beginning to unfold. "Do you know what it's like to want something you shouldn't have?" Victor's voice startled me in the silence of my room. He stood in the doorway, the dim hallway light outlining his broad frame. His question felt more like a confession, and it hung between us, heavy and unspoken. I sat up slowly, my breath catching. "What are you doing here?" I asked, my voice betraying a mix of confusion and dread. He stepped inside, closing the door behind him with a deliberate softness. "Couldn't sleep," he said, as if that explained why he was standing in my room at this hour. The room seemed smaller with him in it, the air thick and charged. I pulled the blanket closer to my chest, the faint scent of him, a mix of cedarwood and something distinctly him, filling the space between us. Victor leaned against my desk, his fingers tracing the edge absently. He wasn't looking at me, but his presence was impossible to ignore. "I'm not sure how it happened," he began, his voice low. "But somewhere along the way, I started noticing things I shouldn't." I stiffened, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure he could hear it. "Victor, stop," I said, though my voice lacked conviction. He turned to me then, his eyes piercing, searching for something in my expression. "Do you want me to?" he asked, the question as much a test as it was a plea. I didn't answer. I couldn't. He moved closer, and suddenly, I was hyper-aware of every inch of him. The way his shirt clung to his shoulders, the faint lines at the corners of his eyes that deepened when he was serious. "Tell me to leave, and I will," he said, his voice a whisper that seemed to settle in my chest. "But if you don't—" His words trailed off unfinished, but I understood exactly what he meant. I wanted to tell him to go, to leave before this went any further. But the words wouldn't come. My throat was dry, my mind a whirlwind of fear and desire. When he reached out, his fingers brushing mine, it felt like the world stopped. His touch was tentative, hesitant, as if he was giving me one last chance to pull away. But I didn't. The distance between us disappeared, and before I could think, his hand was on my cheek, his thumb grazing my skin. I closed my eyes, the weight of his touch both intoxicating and suffocating. "This is wrong," I murmured, though my voice lacked the strength to make it true. "I know," he said, his forehead resting against mine. "But I can't stop." His lips hovered just over mine, and for a moment, time seemed to stretch, the world narrowing to just the two of us. And then he kissed me. It wasn't tentative or unsure. It was deliberate, like a dam breaking, years of restraint crumbling in an instant. His hands moved to my shoulders, pulling me closer, and I melted into him despite every voice in my head screaming at me to stop. When we finally broke apart, the silence between us was deafening. Victor sat back, running a hand through his hair. He looked at me with an expression I couldn't decipher, part guilt, part longing, part something else entirely. "This can't happen again," he said, though the way his eyes lingered on me told a different story. I nodded, but we both knew it was a lie. Whatever line we'd crossed wasn't something we could erase, no matter how hard we tried. The rest of the night passed in a haze. Victor left eventually, the door clicking shut behind him, but his presence lingered, a phantom I couldn't shake. I lay awake, replaying everything in my mind. The way he'd looked at me, the way his touch had felt, the way I'd wanted it even though I knew I shouldn't. Morning came too quickly, and with it, the weight of what had happened. My reflection in the mirror looked the same, but I felt different, like something fundamental had shifted inside me. Victor avoided me that day, his usual ease replaced with a quiet tension that made the house feel colder. But every glance, every accidental brush of hands, reminded me that the breaking point wasn't just a moment. It was the beginning of something far more dangerous. And deep down, I knew this wasn't over. "Do you regret it?" Victor's question broke the silence as we stood alone in the kitchen later that night. He wasn't looking at me, his attention fixed on the glass of water in his hand, but I could feel the weight of his words pressing against my chest. I hesitated, unsure of what he wanted me to say, or what I was even supposed to feel. "I don't know," I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. His shoulders tensed, and he set the glass down with a sharp clink. "That's not an answer, Jules." I flinched at the sound of my name, the intimacy of it cutting deeper than I expected. "What do you want me to say? That it didn't mean anything? That it was a mistake?" My words came out harsher than I intended, but I didn't try to take them back. He turned to face me, his expression unreadable. "I don't know what I want," he admitted. I can't stop thinking about it. About you." The tension between us hadn't faded in the days since it happened. If anything, it had grown, stretching thin like a wire about to snap. Victor avoided me as much as he could during the day, but at night, I'd catch him staring, his eyes heavy with the same mix of longing and guilt that mirrored my own. My mother seemed oblivious to the shift in the house, her focus consumed by work and the endless demands of her career. She barely noticed when Victor grew quieter, when I started retreating to my room more often. But I noticed everything. One evening, a week after it happened, I found myself sitting on the edge of my bed, staring at the door. I didn't know what I was waiting for, or maybe I did. The memory of his touch, his kiss, haunted me in ways I couldn't explain. It wasn't just the act itself, but the emotions tangled up in it. The forbidden thrill, the vulnerability, the way he'd looked at me like I was the only thing that mattered. I hated myself for wanting more. When the knock came, I didn't need to ask who it was. Victor stepped inside, closing the door behind him. He didn't speak at first, just stood there, his presence filling the room in a way that made my heart race. "We need to talk," he said finally, his voice low but firm. I nodded, though I wasn't sure I was ready for whatever this conversation would bring. "I can't do this," he said, pacing the room like a man on the edge of a cliff. "It's wrong. It's selfish. Your mother," he stopped, running a hand through his hair. "She doesn't deserve this." "You think I don't know that?" I shot back, my voice breaking. "You think I haven't thought about what this would do to her?" He froze, his eyes locking on mine. "Then why Jules? Why didn't you stop me?" The question hit like a blow, but I refused to look away. "Because I didn't want to," I admitted, the truth spilling out before I could stop it. "Because for once, I wanted something for myself." The room fell into a heavy silence, the weight of our words settling around us like a shroud. Victor sank onto the edge of the bed, his head in his hands. "This isn't who I am," he said, his voice muffled. "I've spent my whole life trying to be the kind of man people can trust. And now you're human," I said softly, sitting down beside him. He looked up at me, his eyes filled with a raw vulnerability that made my chest ache. "This can't end well," he said, and I knew he was right. But even as he said it, his hand found mine, his fingers curling around mine like a lifeline. The days that followed were a blur of stolen glances and unspoken tension. We didn't talk about what we'd do next, didn't try to define the mess we created. But deep down, I knew this couldn't last. One night, as I sat alone in the darkened living room, Victor came to me. He stood in the doorway for a moment, his expression conflicted. "I'm leaving," he said, the words cutting through the air like a knife. "Your mother deserves better than this. And so do you." I didn't try to stop him. What could I say? As I watched him walk away, I felt a strange mix of relief and heartbreak. The house felt emptier without him, but maybe that was the way it had to be. Maybe some secrets were never meant to stay.